Hello, everyone. My name is Steve O'Neill,
And I'm Terry Arroyo.
and welcome to our ChefConf talk, JM Family's Journey with Chef, the first 5 years. Our talk's intended for folks like us, enterprises with large, complex ecosystems that are using or starting to use Chef. And if that's not you, we're hopeful there's still some bits that will resonate with you or help out. All right, so some brief introductions before we get into the talk. As I said, I'm Steve O'Neill. I'm currently a cloud engineer at JM Family and our Chef product owner. I started using Chef about 5 years ago, around the same time JM Family was. And for me, it just felt like a much better way to automate a lot of the things I had already done to that point in my career, middleware administration, monitoring. And this is around the time that I met Terry.
Hi, everyone. My name is Terry Arroyo. I work at JM Family with Steve O'Neill. Both of us were part of our DevOps team. I'm now our technical architect for the operations team. And thank you all for being here.
So, what's on the agenda? We'll talk about why we selected Chef and our journey with it over the last 5 years. We'll share how we got started, what's worked well from us, and some of the emergent challenges we've had to learn from on the way. Next, we'll give you some context about our environment before taking a high-level look at some of our workflows. And finally, we'll wrap up with some thoughts about what we think the future will look like. And who is JM Family? We are a privately held, diversified automotive company founded in 1968 by the automotive pioneer Jim Moran. He partnered with Toyota Motor Sales to help expand their presence in the US market. And today, we're the world's largest independent distributor of Toyotas.
And we are number 20 on the list of America's largest private companies by Forbes, and number 26 on the 100 best companies to work for list from Fortune. We've been on that list for 22 consecutive years.
Okay, so now let's get into our journey with Chef. Why are we even on this journey? So, back in 2014, we had begun our journey to the cloud. And one of the fundamental beliefs we subscribed to was disposable infrastructure. And why did we want that? Well, because we believed that disposable infra would give us speed and resiliency. If we needed more of something, spin it up. It should automatically work. If you don't need it anymore, great. Destroy it. Save money. We had started with another configuration management product, and it really wasn't measuring up to what we had envisioned. So we started looking around at other options. This is when we found that Chef could be an improvement. Being a majority Windows shop, the Windows features were the best we had evaluated. Also, the reliability level of the enterprise support would be a big upgrade over what we had at the time. And of course, it aligned with our vision of disposable infra. So by 2015, we had made the decision to pivot to the tool that was the best fit for us, which was Chef.
Our journey started in 2015 and 2016. I'd been working on DSC and PowerShell automation for various tasks around the enterprise. We had some other teams working with SaltStack, and that's when we kind of found Chef. We needed a tool that supported all those different platforms we were working on, all the different initiatives that we could consolidate our resources onto.
Then by 2017, 2018, we'd overcome our first set of challenges and had started scaling out the patterns and solutions we developed to that point, which of course brought on new emergent issues. And now, over the last 18 months or so, having spent applying our lessons learned from getting started and scaling out, we can say we feel pretty good about many of the decisions and know most of our underlying pain points. So, what do we need to keep doing? What do we need to revisit? Things like that. We'll visit each of these in turn, and let's get started with getting started. So, as we're getting started with Chef, there were a number of challenges we had to work through. Not just Chef, but we had a number of other tools and architectures we're bringing in to try to change our culture and be more automated, right? AWS, Terraform, Git, these were new to a lot of people. And with this, we had complete freedom to come up with solutions. There weren't many prescriptive approaches on how to do things the right way the first time. You didn't know if you're creating the next awesome reusable asset or something that's going to haunt you for years to come. So we did overcome some of those challenges, right? And we built a lot of great stuff. We had that new tool energy. We wanted to automate all the things, system config, app deployments, orchestration. If there was something we could automate, let's try to use Chef. It was a hammer and everything looked like a nail.
There were some emergent issues that we had to deal with. We had some difficulties around our expanding footprint, how best to manage all these systems. There were different parts of service discovery and orchestration that we had to figure out. How best do we deploy a clustered system? How do these nodes detect that their partner nodes exist? And then the cookbook standards were a new thing for most of us, programming standards in general. Most of us were infrastructure admins that were picking up developing. We were not developers to start with. So linting was a big point of contention early on. You know, why can't I use double quotes instead of a single here? It works just fine. I was against it at the beginning just because of how annoying it was. I've become a staunch proponent of it now because of how valuable it is to have coding standards and linting standards and test your code and all of these things that make resilient infrastructure and infrastructure as code so reliable.
So in retrospect, we can say we successfully bootstrapped our automation capabilities with Chef during this period. This is exciting. This is great. This helps us when we evolve our cloud architecture, and now we're scaling out even faster than before. So based on the feedback from our first 2 years, what changes did we make? Well, it's going to sound simple, but we emphasized the things that worked and de-emphasized the things that didn't. If you tell a doctor it hurts when you do this, the doctor will tell you, stop doing this, right? We found out the wrapper cookbook pattern was a good one. More on how we're using those later in the presentation. We also documented our patterns and flows at that point in time, which helped us onboard resources that were new to Chef. On the other side of that, some things just were not working for us. Maybe they'd become too cumbersome or have been generally dissuaded from use by Chef or the Chef community. They were not bringing us value, or worse yet, they were creating bad tech debt. So we stopped doing them. For example, we stopped using features like node search and roles. Some orchestration scenarios didn't work nicely for us with Chef. So for the handful of times that we had to do orchestration, we did it manually. We also found that InSpec was totally sufficient for our cookbook testing needs. Chef Spec was over testing for us. So we didn't do that anymore. Let's take a look at some exciting changes that happened in this period, which improved our flows. Early in it, we were able to adopt Chef's delivery product, which standardized a workflow for us for cookbook changes. That consistency also helped us onboard new Chef resources, as there were fewer variables for them to deal with. It lowered the complexity. Another important process for us, and for many organizations, is deploying our own apps. Automating this process became a point of emphasis because that's what the business really cares about, the apps. It's another item we'll take a closer look at a little later on in the presentation. We continue to work with our internal product owners to turn their deployment standards into code, increasing our total infrastructure automation capabilities. One more subtle but impactful workflow change was how we were accessing secrets in our cookbook. We had been using a custom resource to this point, but found that we could take that code and put it behind a helper instead. It gave us a few wins, and we have a slide on that coming up next.
So there were some issues that we found along the way. Deprecated product versions was the first one. Chef 12 was being deprecated in the later part of 2018. We knew we needed to move to a new version. That was not simple. There was a lot of cookbooks and a lot of code that we had to update. Some of the public cookbooks that we utilize needed to be updated. So there was a lot of work we put into just getting the latest version of the cookbooks that we need into our supermarket, making sure that all of our clients were converging, going back to old applications and uplifting them to work with Chef 14. It was kind of a troublesome time for us. The other thing we ran into is the depth solving madness, as we'll call it. There was a situation where suddenly applications were not getting the versions of the cookbooks that we thought they should be getting. Definitely weren't getting the latest versions, even though the environment was unpinned. We found out that the depth solving was just taking too long. We had too many nodes. There were too many cookbooks. And it would basically give up and try to just pick a good enough version. We ended up having to clean the server of a bunch of old cookbooks. That took me and Steve quite some time to figure out. We never exactly trusted Knife Tidy entirely, so we were a little more manual about the process. We just wanted to make sure it went well. It did go well in the end, and we did solve our problems. Dev challenges were the other thing that we ran into. So all of these workflows and all of these standards did lead to a lot of front-end configuration. So when we were onboarding someone new, we had to set up their delivery client, install Chef DK and configure that, make sure that they had all the keys that they needed to be able to run Kitchen. We tried to get VMware working. We didn't quite get it working. We did get EC2 working really well, so we primarily did our development in EC2. Around this period, we also had an OpenStack environment that we were trying to deploy applications into. With limited success at that point in time, we couldn't run Vagrant because we had VDI, which didn't at the time, because of the technology we were using, support virtualization. So there were a lot of challenges and a lot of different things that we had done. But at this point, there was a fairly heavy load on the new developer that we did need to solve.
All right, so before we move on to the next bit, let's take a quick look at how we iterated on our secrets. In the code example on the left, we have a custom resource that looks up secrets and stores it in the run state. The template resource then has to evaluate that during the run phase using lazy. This isn't the cleanest way to do it. Since it's just information retrieval and not truly a custom resource, let's just put it behind a helper method. So in the code example on the right, in line 2, we do that. We use read secret to just go and look it up during the compile phase. Then the template resource can also use it during the compile phase to get what it needs. This makes it more readable, and we can drop lazy. Overall, this was a pretty challenging period for us as we realized some limitations of our initial vision. But we also had an opportunity to adjust. So where does that lead us today? Once again, our cloud architecture evolved, and our node count has grown accordingly as well. We'll be over 1,500 nodes by the end of this year. So what were our lessons learned from that middle period, right? We learned to prioritize fixing things for net new first. Due to all the pinning that we've done, it was hard to go back and fix everything at once. So we definitely wanted to, anything that's new that gets deployed, have it be right. We learned to automate strategically. If it takes a long time to automate something that isn't automation friendly and we need to get it done, let's take it as far as it can go. And yeah, it might make sense to do those last few steps by hand, especially if you're only going to be doing it a handful of times. There's not as much value there. For cookbook testing, we learned to use policy file instead of Burks file, which gave us some big wins as far as concurrent testing. And we learned to use Kitchen EC2 over Vagrant or VMware, mostly because we were on Windows VDI and we just did not have good experiences at the time with the VMware plugins, which we may want to revisit. I know there's been some updates. And Terry mentioned the Knife Tidy wins before, where we used that to clean up the Chef server.
That brings us into the present, where we want to talk about the thrill of automation. We've been able to take our old workflow from delivery and transfer that into a GitLab CI pipeline. We're heavy GitLab users, and so using the GitLab CI/CD, we're able to deliver cookbooks from inside of the same repository that we store our code, which is a great simplification for us. Everybody has access to Git, everybody commits their code there. By moving that workflow into Git, we've removed the entire need to configure delivery clients on people's workstations. They have a separate a pipeline inside of workflow. It's a lot easier to iterate on the pipelines as well. So that's been great for us. Feature flags gave us a lot more control in our environment. We use them to install opt-in only software. So costly items like APM for critical applications, exceptions like not joining the domain, and disabling agents which may not be required for specific deployments. Feature flags have really been great. And then inspect validating new instances. We've been able to increase the quality of our deliverable by utilizing inspect to check for required components that would sometimes be missing in builds due to various environmental issues. Maybe that agent couldn't get copied from a remote system, or maybe Chef just failed to connect to a vault and pull a secret, whatever it might be. These inspect tests gave us the confidence in the product that we were delivering to our customers, which has really increased our overall quality.
We're still figuring out how to deal with our cookbooks that were built around community cookbooks that have become deprecated or fallen out of favor. Poise and Windows come to mind. A lot of this is improved in Chef 16 since many of the Windows resources were moved into there, but there's still some rewrites of key internal cookbooks we're going to have to do. The update process to 16 is going to be much smoother this time than it was with the last major version update that we did. The Chef code base is getting more stable, which is great. But the Chef Infra life cycle of every 2 years is still a challenge for us. Also, there are some systems that are high touch and users that are on them. It's not completely hands off. We still want to use Chef to at least automate the initial system setup, but then what? How can users and Chef coexist on these systems where it's required? And finally, although our Chef activities have been focused mainly on the cloud, we are using it for on-prem as well, and we need to manage that situation better. There's a lot of opportunity to improve. And that brings us up to where we are today. Terry's going to get into some of the details around our GitLab CI pipeline next, before giving some additional context around our environment, and we'll show a high-level view of our workflows.
Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about our GitLab CI cookbook pipeline. So before we had automate and workflow, we have the delivery review process where we had to go ahead and configure that client on every single person's system. We had a separate workflow that had to be maintained and had its own specific requirements. That pipeline was embedded in each cookbook, so it was hard to impose standards. If we had to update it, we had to force people to update it as they updated cookbooks, or go update cookbooks that we didn't really want to update just to have the pipeline be updated. There was somewhat of an awkward code review process when we were doing that. At some point in the middle there, some runners had stopped working for us. We had to redo them, so I worked with Chef DK3, and the general features were pretty simple items like linting, kitchen test, metadata, sanity check. So now we get to our new GitLab CI pipeline. We pretty much simplified everything down to a merge request. You fork the cookbook, you clone it, you branch it, you make your updates, you go ahead and push it back up to your fork. It'll then run the pipeline, validate that everything's working. It'll do all of the linting, validating the metadata. It'll do the kitchen tests. If that's successful, you then open up that merge request and then runs the pipeline again, but if successful, delivers the cookbook. The code review process is the same for all of our other code bases, which is fantastic, and the pipeline's able to reference another repo, so we don't have to embed the pipeline into each cookbook. We're actually able to just target that other repo, and we can update that repo and use things like tags for unstable or stable, and it gives us a lot of flexibility in how we iterate on the pipeline and implement new features. In addition, we use the updated Chef DK or Chef Workstation along with CookStyle for a modern linting experience, which is wonderful. Just being able to cook style and not having to worry about RuboCop. RuboCop is a pain in the butt. CookStyle is fantastic. We really like it. It also allowed us to maintain parity with the existing pipeline. It was really easy to lint and kitchen test and check the metadata against the supermarket. Those things were really simple to implement. And then on top of that, we use Kubernetes GitLab runners. So we actually have a Kubernetes cluster that we provision the runners onto. It's a super fast and it's stable, and we're able to get those runners provisioned just in time and deleted immediately after use. So let's look at what the actual cookbook pipeline is. We use the Chef supplied Chef DK Docker image. You can see at the top image, Chef DK latest. The stages we use are info, lint, kitchen, and deliver. We accept the Chef license. I think that's something that we all have to do at this point. Starting with the first stage is info. I just like to give an environment check. Who am I? Where am I? What files are here? What version of Chef am I running? A little bit of sanity for the logs. And then I lint. So we run cook style first. We check the cookbook version against the metadata. I do some really cheesy grepping and awking to get the cookbook version, put that into the variable, echo it out, check supermarket, do some similar cheesy lookups, and then if they equal each other, I throw an error, and if they don't, and then we're good. Next, we go to kitchen. We go ahead and do a kitchen converge -c, so we converge all the suites at the same time, and then we verify them after the fact. I go ahead and I save those artifacts in GitLab because I want to save that output so that people can go back and review it and see if maybe there was a problem or something. Just a little bit of reference. We let those expire in 14 days so they don't fill up our instance. And then we destroy the instances. Kitchen destroy -c, same thing, concern destroy. Finally, we deliver. So we go ahead and only deliver if we're in the repo where we keep our cookbooks. And that's a neat thing you can do with GitLab, where this pipeline, if you're running it on a fork, will just run those first 3 stages. But if you're running it from the merge requested cookbooks repo, it will actually do that 4th stage, which will upload and share it out into supermarket. So Chef server and your supermarket server, which are pretty cool little feature.
So before we get into our workflows, we'd like to give some context about our environment. So within the context of Chef, what does our environment look like? We've got a single cloud provider. We got 3 data centers on which we're using Chef. Like I said before, we're majority Windows. We still have a little bit of Linux, and that's still important for us. And in terms of total Chef size, we're at about 1,500 nodes and growing. We have about 20 cookbooks that get a high degree of reuse in kind of our base cookbook deployment. And then we have about 50 cookbooks that are used across our run lists. All right, now to give you some context about our cookbook types. We like to think of our cookbook types as a simple hierarchy. So what does that look like? Our most basic unit, we call library cookbooks. Like many organizations, we utilize a company-specific prefix. In this example, it's JM underscore. They're intended to be composable and have a narrow focus. They could be written from scratch or be wrappers around public cookbooks. Library cookbooks replace previously manual steps for setting up systems or software. The more they are reused, the more value they deliver, since that's one fewer time we have to do things manually. These typically aren't listed directly in a run list. Also, in most cases, we haven't gotten away from recipe-based cookbooks. We know we need to be moving to custom resources. And then there's the second type, which we call app cookbooks. The app cookbook gets namespace quite plainly with app underscore. The app cookbook is what's typically expected to be in a run list. They're going to compose the library cookbooks. The nice thing about this is that you can integration test that composed unit in Kitchen, and that'll give you the high degree of confidence that when you deploy, it works as tested. On the downside, there are issues with multi-node testing. I think Kitchen Terraform might be an interesting way to approach solving this. There were some other ChefConf presentations recently about that we're interested in exploring. And also, let's say you have a large cookbook with a lot of suites, and after an hour of testing, that last inspect test fails. For like a one-line change, that's super frustrating, and we want to be able to do that better as well. Now, our app cookbooks further break down into 2 types. There's a generic pattern we use, and then there's also a specific pattern for the .NET apps that we deploy. Let's look at those next. So our generic pattern is what we use for deploying apps that aren't .NET apps or deploying a COTS product like Chef Automate. So for example, with Chef Automate, it would be app underscore Chef Automate for the app cookbook, and that would wrap our JM underscore base cookbook and our JM underscore Chef Automate cookbook. The downsides here are potentially long testing cycles, as mentioned before. And then that takes us to our bread and butter for our enterprise, which is deploying the .NET apps. We have a lot of these, so it makes sense to automate them. Our .NET standard cookbook varies only by the inputs. It doesn't change all that much. It hides a lot of complexity. There's a lot of cookbooks involved, but it's for this very narrow use case, but we do it a lot. So that's good. So then the emergent issues with this, as I mentioned, the complexity, right? So when we do need to update it, that's a lot of stuff to work through, a lot of variables, a lot of different situations we have to account for.
In addition, when we first started this, I was noodling around in the chef documentation and I found out about Burke's Viz, and I was like, oh, it's going to be really cool and be able to graph out all our dependencies. That was not as good of an idea as it sounded.
Yeah, don't look directly at the Burke's Viz for this one.
Yuck.
Yeah, it's not the best thing to look at, but it's the user that doesn't see this, which is good, right? So with our environment and cookbook structure in mind, let's take a look at some of our high-level workflows. We're going to talk about cookbook creation, cookbook updates, and provisioning those apps. To start off with cookbook creation, let's say you're a user that wants to start work on a new cookbook. We have a cookbook generator in Jenkins with all of our standards built in. So you go there and you create it. That creates the repository in GitLab, our OSR, original source repository. Or if you already know the cookbook exists, you find it. From there, you fork it, create a private source repository, PSR. You clone it locally, creating your local source repository, LSR. And this results in a process of find it, fork it, clone it. So that'll give you your remote origin and your remote upstream back to the OSR. Now, let's take a look at the cookbook update flow that we use. As a developer, you want to make your changes and send them to delivery review in Chef Workflow. Chef Workflow will take that and update master in GitLab. It'll then also update it in the Chef server and update it in Supermarket. Now, although we're still using delivery, we're very close to cutting over to our future state, which is using the GitLab pipeline Terry created. So that would look like just about the same thing. You'll have a local user, but they'll be using Chef Workstation, right? Because we're up to date now. They do the merge request to GitLab. The GitLab CI runs. That'll merge it back into master. That'll update it in the Chef server, as well as Supermarket. Now, let's talk about that most common, most important scenario for us, which is deploying the apps. What does that look like? So earlier, we mentioned how we had a scaffolding cookbook for deploying our .NET apps. Let's look at that workflow now. First, I want to highlight the furthest left component, which is the image build process. People talk about shifting left, what you can build in to there so you don't have to do it later on. So we start with our AWS AMIs. We run it through Packer with the things that we want to bake in, and we ship that out to our AWS accounts. Now, the user doesn't need to know about any of this. All they care about is clicking buttons and deploying their apps, right? So in Jenkins, they have an option to deploy their app or promote it between environments. And that's all they need to see or care about, right? So when they do click that button to deploy, it'll kick off a provisioning process whereby Terraform will create us an autoscale group with a launch template. And that's going to be the thing that launches the instances. At instance launch, we're going to have our user data writes our chef's first boot.json, which is used to bootstrap Chef. The EC2 lifecycle events for that instance launch is going to be sent to our custom eventing system, which is really just a bunch of lambdas executing code, right? That eventing system is going to send an SSM document back to the instance to say, hey, now run Chef. The SSM will use that document to kick off Chef Infra. It'll use that first boot.json, which includes the run list of that .NET cookbook. Eventually it finishes. The chef handler in there is going to send the event to the custom eventing system, which is going to say, hey, SSM, run inspec. SSM runs inspec. After inspec validates that everything's okay, it's going to send a notification back to the user that their environment's ready. And at the end of all this, when the infrastructure is torn down, the lifecycle event on that instance is going to notify or be seen, I guess, by the custom eventing system. And that's going to kick off another function to go out and delete the associated node and client objects from the chef server. So that kind of makes it a closed loop process. Let's talk about our future. But before we do that, looking back at where we were 5 years ago to where we are today, I'd certainly say that our culture has changed significantly and for the better. We're much more automated now. It's not an easy thing for a 50-year-old business with over 4,300 associates. Instead of manual machine deployments and hours or days of configuration, we can complete most deployments today in less than an hour, many times in just minutes and in a repeatable way. That's awesome. The conversation has changed from why is it taking weeks to get this infrastructure deployed to why is it taking an hour to deploy my infrastructure? And this conversation is happening in code for us. It's easy and natural to focus on the emergent issues because we want to problem solve and remove obstacles. It can feel like since there's always yet another issue, no progress is being made. This isn't true. Being laser focused on the problems at hand, you can overlook all the problems you solved along the way and the obstacles that have already been removed. To highlight a phrase that the military strategist John Boyd often used, progress is confusion at a higher level. These new problems are a sign of progress, and hearing folks raise them up is a sign we're still hungry to improve further. So what's next? We will need to continue our cycles of improvement. We know we need to improve the self-service capabilities for our users. We know we need to improve our control plane for rolling out updates. The lifecycle management for that as well, with the 2-year lifecycle on Chef Infra, keeping our cookbooks up to date with the version changes in Chef Infra. And then our workflow changes. We definitely think policy files have a place. We just don't know how it's going to fit best for us yet. So we need to take some time to explore that and prove it out. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we need to address our issues around testing to make that less painful at the edges. And that's all. Thanks for watching our presentation about our journey with Chef. We hope you got something out of it. We want to thank all the Chef contributors at JM Family that got us to where we are today. We're also thankful to our leadership team for the opportunity and support in making this presentation.
And I'd like to give a big thank you to Chef for this opportunity. It's been a lot of fun for me and Steve. I'd also like to just let everybody know ChefConf is a wonderful thing. The first year I went there, I got to meet so many people. I learned so much. It was an incredible experience for me. I am so thankful for the opportunity to give back to ChefConf, and I just want to influence everyone, especially people who had plans to go this year but couldn't. Definitely try to go next year. It's fantastic meeting the people that you only ever know from their names and cookbook credits. It's really just the kind of thing that you cannot fully replicate online. So if you get the opportunity in the future, take it. Go to ChefConf. It is a great conference.